Joining me now is trial consultant Richard Gabriel, who's worked on cases ranging from Casey Anthony to Enron, O.J. Simpson to Whitewater. He's done it all, and he's also the author of Acquittal. An insider reveals the stories and strategies behind today's most infamous verdicts. Richard, thank you so much for joining me. This is really a fascinating conversation I think we're going to have. You have Bill Cosby in this case. He's a legendary entertainer. There's been so much pretrial publicity. You have more than 50 accusers here. How hard is it going to be to pick a jury that isn't biased?
Well, the short answer is it's impossible. And this poses one of the biggest challenges in any of these cases. The truth is we've got this conflation of cases. We've got the court of public opinion, which has already convicted Bill Cosby. You've got his civil cases, and you've got this criminal case. The truth here is that the jury will have heard already tremendous amounts of publicity, and whether the judge rules that some of these women can testify or can't testify, they've already heard it. So the system provides us supposedly with an impartial jury, a jury that is disinterested in this. But we have this little thing called constitutional rights and due process, which we have to obey, which makes it difficult for jurors to somehow try to put aside or disregard things that they've already heard about, sometimes in volumes. Makes it very difficult for both the defense and, quite frankly, the prosecution in this case.
Okay, even for the prosecution, who's it more difficult for, the defense or the prosecution?
Much more difficult for the defendant in this case, because there's a presumption of guilt, and which is obviously not how our system works. There's a presumption of innocence. But the truth here is that when jurors and everybody has heard about all these other women that have made similar charges, there's a presumption that he's already guilty. So then go ahead and try and prove that you're innocent, which is, again, counterintuitive to our system. So it's more difficult for the defendant in a case like this, but it also raises the bar for evidence for the prosecutors. The jury expects kind of a high bar from them because they've seen so much about the case.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. What is the defense looking for in a juror? What is the prosecution looking for?
Well, defense is looking for a juror, quite frankly, somebody who doesn't want to convict Dr. Huxtable. Somebody who's really sort of attached to that image of Bill Cosby as that fatherly, paternal figure and remembers him fondly. Someone who's skeptical of all these women, someone who might be skeptical of the district attorney who, quite frankly, ran a political campaign on this case, and also might be skeptical about that year-long delay before the woman went to the police and posed the charges against Cosby. That kind of skepticism, I think, is what the defense is looking for. Prosecutors want people who, quite frankly, already believe that Cosby's guilty, who will give great amount of weight to all of these women who have similarly charged it, people who are, quite frankly, appalled by the behavior, by his strong moral stand, and yet his behavior behind closed doors with quaaludes and allegedly assaulting these women. So that kind of moral indignation is what, quite frankly, the prosecutors are going to be looking for in this case.
Is there, do you think, a certain type of juror, maybe a woman or a man or someone who's older, who would be more likely to say, no, this is the Bill Cosby that I've always known and loved. I don't believe he would have done this?
Well, that's why I think both sides have to very closely talk to the jurors about this. You know, if people just have such fond memories of him, you know, from his recordings and from the Cosby Show and from his specials, and from Fat Albert, they just have this image of him as this really quite avuncular or fatherly figure. They're just not going to want to believe that these women's, especially this woman's case, is true. The prosecutor has to look very keenly at that. The gender issue is kind of an interesting one, because sometimes women could be more harsh judges of other women. Sometimes men are more harsh judges of other men. So they have to talk to these jurors to find out really on which side do they fall. Are they going to be a man? Is it going to be a man who is protective of women? Is it going to be a woman who's more critical of women? And that's how gender, I think, can play out in an interesting way in this case.
Oh, that sure is. So we've just learned that Camille Cosby is going to be testifying this week in a defamation case. This is a civil case against her husband, not to be confused with this criminal case in Pennsylvania. But could her testimony impact that criminal case in Pennsylvania?
Well, it definitely could, because the difficulty is that if it does come into the public record, then the prosecutors, depending on what they want, may want to use that, or Cosby's attorney may want to use that. Then it becomes a legal battle as to whether that is relevant to the case at hand. Of course, it's going to all enter into the court of public opinion, and that can obviously have effect on jurors prior to them being seated. But her testimony can be key, depending on what she says or what she doesn't say in the case, and can be potentially harmful to Cosby. It really is not particularly a good thing for him in this case.
That we will hear her voice finally. All right, Richard Gabriel, fascinating discussion. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.